Most people do not realize how deeply they were trained to admire endurance before they ever understood themselves. You can see it in the way exhaustion gets praised more than honesty. A person says they are barely holding themselves together, and the world often responds with admiration instead of concern. Somewhere along the way, suffering became confused with strength, and survival became confused with wisdom. That confusion follows people for years because it hides inside language that sounds noble on the surface. You may notice something interesting when you begin watching this pattern closely. Many people do not actually know what healing feels like, but they know exactly what pushing feels like. They know how to override exhaustion. They know how to silence emotional signals long enough to finish responsibilities. They know how to remain functional while slowly disconnecting from themselves. Because of this, they often mistake continued movement for continued growth, even when their inner life has already begun collapsing beneath the pressure. The body eventually reveals what the mind keeps trying to negotiate away. Fatigue is not always lack of discipline. Irritability is not always immaturity. Emotional numbness is not always stability. Sometimes the system is signaling that it has carried more pressure than it can integrate at its current level of coherence. When this happens, continuing to force movement does not produce transformation. It usually produces fragmentation disguised as productivity. A person can continue performing long after they stop feeling alive inside their own experience. That is one of the most dangerous forms of disconnection because society often rewards it. The exhausted worker gets praised for dedication. The emotionally unavailable parent gets praised for sacrifice. The person who never rests gets admired for resilience. But if you look carefully, many of these people are slowly losing contact with joy, sensitivity, spontaneity, and presence while being told they are succeeding. This is why pushing through pain often delays integration instead of accelerating it. Integration requires contact. It requires the nervous system to actually process what has happened instead of endlessly suppressing it beneath motion. A wound cannot reorganize itself while the entire system remains trapped in survival pacing. The body may keep functioning, but functioning and integrating are not the same process. One maintains continuation, the other restores relationship between the self and experience. You can see this clearly after periods of intense emotional stress. At first, many people become more productive, not less. They clean obsessively, work longer hours, stay constantly distracted, or keep themselves socially overstimulated because movement creates temporary distance from internal overwhelm. From the outside, this can look impressive. Internally, however, the person is often running from stillness because stillness would force unresolved emotion to finally become visible. Constant motion becomes emotional anesthesia wearing the mask of responsibility. There is a reason breakdowns often happen after the crisis appears to be over. The person survives the divorce, the grief, the burnout, the collapse, or the prolonged stress period, and only afterward do they suddenly feel unable to function normally. This confuses many people because they assume the danger has already passed. But the nervous system frequently delays processing until survival urgency decreases enough for suppressed material to surface safely. What looks like regression is often delayed integration finally beginning to occur. That changes the meaning of emotional collapse entirely. Collapse is not always destruction. Sometimes collapse is the body refusing to continue carrying unresolved pressure through artificial stabilization. The system stops cooperating with the identity that has been forcing continuation at any cost. Energy disappears because the structure consuming that energy is no longer sustainable. The person interprets this as failure because they were taught endurance matters more than alignment. You may also notice that people who glorify endurance often struggle to receive support without guilt. They learned early that their worth was connected to performance, reliability, usefulness, or emotional suppression. Rest feels undeserved unless exhaustion becomes severe enough to justify it publicly. Slowing down creates anxiety because stillness threatens identities built around being needed, productive, or endlessly capable. So they continue carrying more than they should, then wonder why joy becomes increasingly inaccessible. There is another layer beneath this that many people miss completely. Prolonged endurance changes perception itself. When a person stays in survival states for too long, they stop evaluating life through aliveness and begin evaluating it through manageability. They no longer ask whether something nourishes them, they ask whether they can tolerate it a little longer. That shift is subtle, but it changes the entire architecture of a life because endurance slowly replaces genuine participation. This is why integration often begins with small forms of honesty rather than dramatic transformation. A person finally admits they are tired in ways sleep cannot fix. They admit they do not actually want the pace they have normalized. They admit certain relationships only survive because emotional truth has been withheld for years. They admit that constantly overcoming pain has become part of their identity. These realizations appear simple on the surface, but they reorganize perception because they interpret unconscious continuation. The interesting thing is that the nervous system responds differently to honesty than it does to force. Force creates contraction because the system prepares for further pressure. Honesty creates space because energy no longer has to sustain false positioning. This is why some people feel emotional release the moment they finally admit what they have been carrying. The external circumstances may remain unchanged, yet the body begins softening because internal conflict decreases. Truth reduces energetic friction. Many people assume healing means becoming stronger at carrying pain. In reality, healing often involves becoming more sensitive to misalignment before suffering intensifies unnecessarily. The person who heals deeply is not always the one who can tolerate the most pressure. Often it is the one who learns to recognize disconnection earlier and respond before fragmentation deepens. This changes the meaning of strength completely. Strength stops meaning emotional suppression and starts meaning honest self contact. You can even observe this in relationships. Some people stay inside emotionally draining dynamics for years because they confuse endurance with loyalty. They believe love means absorbing increasing amounts of pain without changing course. But eventually, the body reveals the cost through anxiety, numbness, resentment, exhaustion, or quiet emotional withdrawal. The relationship may technically continue, yet genuine connection slowly disappears because survival has replaced openness. What most people call resilience is sometimes only prolonged adaptation to unhealthy conditions. Real resilience is different. Real resilience includes the ability to remain connected to yourself while navigating difficulty. It includes the ability to feel without drowning, rest without guilt, and change direction without interpreting it as weakness. That form of resilience creates integration because it allows experience to move through the system instead of becoming trapped inside it. You may begin noticing how often the world encourages continuation without asking whether continuation is wise. People are taught to push harder before they are taught to listen deeper. They are taught to manage symptoms before understanding causes. They are taught to remain dependable even while internally collapsing. Over time, this creates entire cultures of exhausted individuals silently performing stability while feeling increasingly disconnected from their own lives. And once you begin seeing this clearly, another question slowly starts emerging beneath the surface. If forcing yourself through pain can delay integration, then what would it mean to build a life that no longer requires constant self abandonment just to keep moving at all? The difficult part is that many people do not recognize self abandonment while it is happening. They imagine self abandonment must feel dramatic or obvious, but most of the time it feels responsible. It feels like staying late again because everyone depends on you. It feels like ignoring exhaustion because there are bills to pay, children to care for, expectations to maintain, or emotional conflicts that seem easier to postpone. The behavior becomes normalized precisely because it appears functional from the outside. Over time, the system adapts to this pattern so completely that discomfort begins feeling more familiar than rest. A person who has lived inside prolonged pressure often becomes uneasy when things finally slow down. Silence feels unnatural. Spaciousness feels undeserved. Ease creates suspicion because the body has been conditioned to associate worth with strain. This is why some people unconsciously recreate stress after peaceful periods. Their nervous system no longer recognizes calm as safe. You can watch this happen in subtle daily ways. Someone finally gets a free evening and immediately fills it with obligations because stillness feels emotionally exposing. Someone takes a vacation but spends the entire time unable to relax because internal momentum never actually stopped moving. Someone leaves a painful relationship only to enter another dynamic built on emotional instability because chaos still feels psychologically familiar. The mind says it wants peace while the body still expects pressure. That expectation changes decision making more than most people realize. A person trapped in endurance based living often chooses what feels manageable instead of what feels alive. They organize their future around minimizing instability rather than increasing authenticity. At first, this seems practical, but eventually the cost becomes visible because a life built entirely around tolerable suffering slowly drains emotional vitality from the system. The person survives, yet no longer feels connected to the fact that they are alive. This is why many forms of burnout are not caused by effort alone. Human beings can work very hard and still remain internally connected when meaning, rest, emotional honesty, and reciprocity exist alongside the effort. Burnout becomes more severe when pressure combines with emotional suppression and prolonged disconnection from personal truth. The exhaustion deepens because the system is carrying both external demand and internal fragmentation simultaneously. One drains energy physically, the other drains coherence psychologically. You may notice that people often wait for a complete collapse before granting themselves permission to change. They continue enduring until the body forces interruption through anxiety, numbness, insomnia, panic, illness, emotional volatility, or profound fatigue. Then they say they had no choice but to stop. But the deeper truth is that the signals existed long before the collapse arrived. The problem was not absence of communication. The problem was conditioning that taught them to ignore communication until pain became impossible to override. This reveals something important about integration itself. Integration is not passive, it requires responsiveness. The system constantly communicates through emotion, sensation, energy levels, attention patterns, and relational reactions. When these signals are ignored repeatedly, unresolved pressure accumulates beneath conscious awareness. The person continues functioning externally while internally drifting further away from themselves. Eventually, the gap between performance and authentic experience becomes too large to sustain comfortably. Many people interpret this drift as loss of motivation. In reality, the deeper issue is often loss of relational connection to the self. Motivation naturally weakens when life becomes organized around obligation instead of aliveness. The system stops producing energy for realities it no longer experiences as meaningful. That is not laziness, it is feedback. The body frequently withdraws enthusiasm from structures that require continuous self betrayal to maintain. There is also a hidden grief inside endurance based living that few people speak about openly. People grieve the years they spent disconnected from themselves. They grieve relationships where they remain silent too long. They grieve opportunities abandoned because fear and survival pacing consume too much energy. They grieve versions of themselves that slowly disappeared beneath pressure, adaptation, and emotional suppression. Sometimes exhaustion is not only physical depletion, sometimes it is accumulated mourning finally surfacing into awareness. This is why emotional release can feel strangely disorienting after long periods of endurance. Once the nervous system stops allocating all resources towards survival maintenance, deeper emotional material begins rising naturally. A person may suddenly cry more easily, feel emotionally raw, or experience unexpected waves of memory and reflection. This often scares people because they assume increased emotion means reduced stability. But many times the opposite is true. The system is finally recovering enough safety to process what it previously had to postpone. You may begin seeing that healing is less about becoming invulnerable and more about restoring responsiveness. A healthy system responds honestly to reality instead of endlessly overriding itself to preserve performance. Fatigue creates rest rather than shame. Pain creates reflection rather than automatic suppression. Misalignment creates recalibration instead of prolonged denial. This responsiveness protects coherence because the person remains connected to their actual experience rather than forcing themselves into chronic internal contradiction. That changes the meaning of discipline as well. Real discipline is not endless self force. Endless force eventually breaks relationship between the self and the system carrying the burden. Real discipline includes listening early enough that collapse becomes less necessary. It includes respecting limits before resentment and fragmentation intensify. It includes making difficult adjustments before the body is forced into emergency interruption. That kind of discipline looks softer externally, but it often requires far more honesty internally. You can see why many people resist this understanding at first. If endurance is no longer the highest virtue, then entire identities may need reevaluation. Some people built their self worth around being the one who never stopped, never complained, never rested, and never needed support. Letting go of that identity can feel frightening because they do not yet know who they are without constant proving. The exhaustion becomes familiar territory even while it quietly consumes them. This is also why integration cannot happen through information alone. A person can intellectually understand everything being said here and still remain trapped in endurance patterns emotionally and behaviorally. Understanding changes very little until the nervous system experiences enough safety to choose differently in real moments. The transformation occurs through lived interruption of old patterns. One honest boundary, one moment of rest without apology, one decision not to abandon the self simply to maintain external continuity. And slowly, through those moments, another way of living begins becoming visible. A person starts realizing that they were never meant to earn their right to exist through exhaustion. They begin recognizing that constant suffering is not proof of depth, maturity, loyalty, or value. They notice how much energy was consumed maintaining identities built around endurance instead of presence. And once that realization deepens fully, the question becomes impossible to avoid much longer. If your life no longer revolves around surviving yourself, what becomes possible for you emotionally, relationally, and internally that endurance alone could never create? What begins to change after endurance is questioned is the meaning of strength itself. Strength stops being measured by how much pain a person can hide while remaining useful. It begins to be measured by how quickly a person can return to truth after noticing they have drifted away from themselves. This is a quieter strength because it does not always impress the room, but it changes the entire inner system because it stops feeding the old belief that suffering must be endured in silence to be meaningful. You may notice that when people first step out of endurance, they often feel weaker rather than stronger. This happens because the old identity was built around pushing, and without pushing, they do not yet know how to recognize their own power. They may rest and feel guilty, speak honestly and feel exposed, set a boundary and feel cruel, or slow down and feel unproductive. These reactions do not mean the new direction is wrong. They mean the nervous system is learning a language it was never taught early enough. The mechanism is simple but not easy. If a person has spent years associating safety with performance, then non performance will initially feel unsafe. If love was connected to being useful, then needing space may feel like abandonment. If belonging depended on emotional control, then honest feeling may feel dangerous. The body does not release those associations just because the mind understands them. It needs repeated evidence that honesty can happen without disaster. This is why integration requires practice rather than only insight. Insight can open the door, but practice teaches the system how to walk through it. Each time a person honors a limit, lets emotion move without turning it into shame, or chooses a slower response instead of automatic overextension, the system receives new evidence. It learns that pain does not have to be pushed through every time it appears. It learns that discomfort can be listened to before it becomes a crisis. The more often this happens, the less endurance has to function as the default method of survival. At this point, people often discover how unfamiliar gentleness feels. Gentleness is sometimes harder than force because force requires less trust. Force says move anyway, decide anyway, perform anyway, keep going anyway. Gentleness asks what is true, what is available, what is sustainable, and what is being ignored. These questions slow a person down, and slowing down may reveal grief that motion kept hidden. But that grief is not a detour from healing. It is part of the integration that endurance delayed. You can see this in the person who finally stops overworking and suddenly feels the emptiness work used to cover. You can see it in the person who stops rescuing others and suddenly meets their own loneliness. You can see it in the person who stops pretending everything is fine and begins feeling the full weight of what was not fine for a very long time. Endurance kept these experiences submerged by keeping the person occupied. When the movement stops, the unfelt life begins speaking. That speaking can feel inconvenient because it interrupts the version of growth that people prefer. Many people want healing to make them more efficient, more attractive, more peaceful, more capable, and more admired. But deep healing often makes a person less available to false demands before it makes them more radiant. It may make them more honest, more selective, more sensitive to strain, and less willing to perform what used to earn approval. This can feel like loss because the old rewards stop working. And that is the heart of the teaching. The spiral does not reward endurance because endurance alone does not create coherence. It can protect life during crisis, but it cannot become the architecture of an awakened life. When endurance becomes identity, the person keeps proving they can survive conditions they were meant to outgrow. They become loyal to the very pattern that is delaying their integration. The issue is not that they endured. The issue is that they began treating endurance as a proof of alignment. There is a difference between necessary endurance and unconscious endurance. Necessary endurance helps you cross a difficult season with dignity. Unconscious endurance keeps you inside a harmful pattern because stopping would force a truth you are not ready to face. Necessary endurance has a purpose and an endpoint. Unconscious endurance becomes a lifestyle. The body knows the difference even when the mind keeps using noble explanations. This is why the body becomes such an honest teacher in this process. It does not care how impressive your explanation sounds. It does not care how many people depend on your self-abandonment. It does not care how spiritual your reason is for pushing past your own limits. It reports the cost through fatigue, tension, resentment, numbness, dread, and collapse. These signals are not enemies of your path. They are the places where your path is asking to become real. The more you listen, the more you begin separating pain that transforms from pain that merely repeats. Transforming pain brings contact, clarity, release, and deeper honesty over time. Repeating pain keeps you trapped in the same cycle with better language. It may look like growth because you keep surviving it, but survival is not always transformation. Sometimes surviving the same wound repeatedly is a sign that the deeper lesson is not to endure it better, but to stop organizing your life around it. This changes how you understand responsibility. Responsibility is not always doing more. Sometimes responsibility is refusing to keep feeding a structure that depends on your depletion. Sometimes it is letting someone be disappointed because rescuing them would require abandoning yourself. Sometimes it is choosing rest before the body has to force it. Sometimes it is admitting that the path forward requires less heroic suffering and more honest adjustment. These choices may not look dramatic, but they are the exact places where integration becomes embodied. Over time, a person who once lived through endurance begins to develop a different rhythm. They still face difficulty, but they no longer worship difficulty. They still commit, but they do not confuse commitment with self-erasure. They still serve, but they do not use service to avoid their own unmet needs. They still grow, but they no longer treat pain as automatic proof that they are on the right path. This rhythm is more mature because it can include challenge without making suffering sacred. You may also begin to recognize that many people will not understand this shift at first. To those who still measure worth by sacrifice, your refusal to overextend may look selfish. To those who benefited from your endurance, your boundaries may look like withdrawal. To those who admire suffering as identity, your peace may look like softness. But your life cannot be built around making your healing understandable to systems that were comfortable with your depletion. At some point, your inner coherence has to become more important than being interpreted correctly. This does not mean you abandon effort. It means effort is returned to its rightful place. Effort is meant to serve alignment, not replace it. When effort becomes a substitute for truth, a person can work endlessly and still remain spiritually and emotionally stalled. But when effort arises from coherence, it has a different quality. It does not feel like dragging the self through life. It feels like participating in a direction that your whole system can recognize. That recognition is subtle at first. It may feel like a little more breath after telling the truth, a little less resentment after honoring a limit, a little more presence after choosing rest instead of performance. These small signals matter because they show that the system is beginning to trust you again. Trust does not return because you promise to be better. It returns because you stop using yourself as the thing to be sacrificed every time pressure appears. And as that trust grows, the old pattern of endurance begins losing its authority. You no longer need to collapse before you believe your own exhaustion. You no longer need a crisis before you allow yourself to change. You no longer need pain to become unbearable before you admit that something is misaligned. This is the deeper reward. Though it is not a reward for endurance, it is the result of listening, responding, and allowing integration to happen before survival has to take over again. So the question is not whether you can keep going. You've already proven that many times. The more honest question is whether continuing in the same way is actually helping you become whole. Because there are seasons where pushing forward preserves the old fracture, and there are seasons where stopping is the first act of real movement. The spiral does not honor pain because it is pain. It honors what pain reveals when you finally stop using endurance to silence it.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.